All right, so for those who are joining us, hello and welcome. This is the last in our series for Blueprints for Action. We've got 3 speakers with us today. If you just bear with us for the last minute while we wait for more people to come and join us. If you have any questions for any of the presenters, please feel free to type them in the chat or in the Q&A function if you want to remain more anonymous. And after all 3 presenters have spoken, we'll bring them all back into a bit of a panel discussion and we'll field those questions into them. And if you're really keen, we can bring you voice and video in as well, and we can let you ask your questions directly. But otherwise, we will take those questions from you and share them. So without further ado, I want to start by saying, G'day, Nāmani. I want to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the original custodians of the land on which the University of Adelaide is built, where we run this seminar series from, and where many of our presenters do their research. So perhaps you can share what country you're zooming in from, whether that's country in Australia, or if you're zooming in from international, let us know. We want to hear where you're coming from. We're really trying to build this series as an inclusive and broad series. So if you have any ideas, share them as well. Today, we've got 3 speakers. First off the rank will be Dr. Alice Jones, who's really looking at, tips and tricks to integrate your science with policy and engaging with policymakers. Straight after Alice, we'll have Dr. Nick Gellie, who's looking at ways to collaborate with other organizations and collaborating to bring conservation success and how you measure that kind of success. And then last but not least, we have Professor Rachel Ankeny, who will be talking about how we can engage the public more with this policy and decision-making processes. So those are our 3 presenters. As I said, each of those presenters will be talking for about 10 minutes each. And then at the end of 3 presentations, we'll have 15 to 20-minute Q&A time where all those questions that you've typed in along the way, we'll bring those and we'll ask that panel and we'll have a discussion. So without further ado, first off, we've got Alice Jones, who, like I said, is looking at tips and tricks to integrate your science with policy. So I'll hand over to you, Alice.
Thanks, Bowie. I'll just share my screen. Can you see it?
Good to go.
Okay, so thanks very much for that introduction, Bowie. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the traditional owners of the land from where I'm talking to you today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. My talk is not so much focused on my research outputs specifically, although there's some examples in there. It's more focusing on my experience and some things that I've learned about informing evidence-based environmental policy and management. So my slides are not changing. There we go. So this is quite a boring slide. I have to apologize. It's a lot of text, but it doesn't go on like this. So just as an overview, in my opinion, the key thing about trying to use your research in an applied way for management and policy is really about finding opportunities to align what you do with the needs of government or peak bodies or industry or managers. So really identifying opportunities to feed in information where there's gaps in knowledge. And so it's key that you understand where, how, and why your research might be useful. And in order to do that, you really need to know about the broader policy and management context that people are working within. So, for example, international, national, state, and local regulations and frameworks, such as, international climate change commitments, conservation bills, acts, and regulations, all of those filter down to even have an impact at local government level. And certainly have an impact at national and state levels. And they really constrain what it is that the government is trying to do or has to do, is obligated to do in certain situations. So understanding those frameworks is really important because it helps you to know to really clearly identify where research outputs can fulfill some of the direct needs of government under those types of obligations. If you're interested in working with industry, then looking at things like their corporate strategy or 5-year plans, etc., can help you to work out how your research might align with where they're planning on going over the next X number of years and where it can fit in with what their needs are. And for NGOs and peak bodies, for example, you might look at things like terms of reference or vision statements, so that you can get an idea of where they stand, what their obligations are to their donors or their membership, and what their stance is on certain things, and therefore how your research might be able to inform that or support their ideas. It's really important to get out and introduce yourself to people, but also to listen to what their needs are. So once you've done a bit of background understanding, there's not really an expectation, I haven't found, from people who work in a policy or management context that you have as much of an understanding about what they do as they have, but just some background information and some context is really helpful. Then you can ask questions and get some feedback from them about how you might be able to help or feed into what they need. On a kind of a more general note, make it easy for people to interpret and access your work. So, for example, open access publications are really important. And if you're not paying for open access, which is really, really difficult, it's very expensive, put preprints of your papers up on repositories, for example. But more than that, try and synthesize your work in a way that is more useful. So reading papers is something that some people in government and management contexts do, but it's easier for them if you've distilled it down to some of the main points. So if you have a paper that's come out, or you're thinking about a grant application that you might want to put in, think about writing a summary for policymakers or a 2-page overview of what it is that you want to do and get feedback from them as to how that fits with what their needs are. Go and present to people. Make sure that people know who you are and what you're doing so that they can come to you as well. It's not always about you having to go to them. So a few examples. I mostly research blue carbon, which is carbon storage in coastal ecosystems. So that's carbon dioxide that's taken up from the atmosphere, and also organic carbon that's stored in the soils. And these ecosystems can be really important for climate change mitigation because they store a really big amount of carbon per hectare. And because of various commitments that Australia has made for emissions reductions under international agreements, there's interest in blue carbon from a federal level and a state and even a local government level. And so some of the work that we've done over the last few years in really quite large projects that have involved multiple institutes and multiple researchers, we've tried to make an effort to distill down some of those main findings and make them easy to express, easy to communicate through the use of things like infographics and also synthesis reports. And we've also put together a research agenda after we finished some of the big projects that we've done over the last few years. So there's been multiple projects, and they're not all led through the University of Adelaide. There's ones that are led through Flinders, and they also are really collaborative. So there's international and interstate collaborators involved in these projects. And we've got together and put together ideas about, okay, where are the knowledge gaps? Where are the roadblocks? What is it that we really need to move forwards in order to kind of get beyond where we are now in terms of our knowledge about blue carbon, and to really enable that knowledge to make some difference in terms of climate change mitigation. And so this is an example of something that we put in our research roadmap. So identifying what it is that we want to do and how that's relevant, and what the outcomes and impacts would be for South Australia if we got those things done. And just very serendipitously, at the same time as our blue carbon projects were finishing up, the South Australian government was developing a blue carbon strategy. So sometimes this really is about just being in the right place at the right time. We can't take nothing to do with the idea of the blue carbon strategy was was our responsibility. That's something government decided to do, but because of our research and because of the links we've made with people in government, we were able to feed our results directly into the development of that strategy, be on the technical reference panel for the strategy. And because of that, we got some of those, particularly the research gaps and the research roadmap ideas, were put into this 5-year strategy that the South Australian government was developing. As well as those South Australian specific things, one thing that was identified in the strategy was the need for an emissions reduction fund for blue carbon. So the emissions reduction fund is basically our national framework in Australia for carbon crediting. So that means that somebody can set up a project which either reduces emissions, for example, from their business or their farm or their industry, or it leads to a sequestration of carbon, so an uptake of carbon from the environment. And then they get carbon credits for that. But it has to align with a really specific methodology that's been published and agreed and, you know, quality controlled. And at the moment, there's no way to do that for blue carbon. So now we're working with the Clean Energy Regulator, which is a federal government department, to develop a method for blue carbon under the Emissions Reduction Fund. And so that's kind of, you know, another level of government that we're able to engage with and influence in terms of some of their decisions around climate mitigation policy. Another example is some work that we've done with SA Water. So you know, in their 4-year plan from 2020 to 2024, they identify sustainable environmental outcomes as a key thing that they're working on. And as part of that, there's specifically work in coastal ecosystems to ensure that water quality is not impacting negatively on seagrass cover. And so with Dr. Ramesh Rajasegaran, who runs the drone hub at the University of Adelaide here, we have worked with scientists from SA Water to try and develop really easily deployable methods for them to use drones to monitor changes in seagrass cover. And the areas that we've been working on that are specific areas that they were interested in because of, for example, outfalls from their wastewater treatment work. So in brief, there's some challenges to doing this type of work. It's a really long game. It takes a long time to build up kind of trusting connections with people in industry and policy and government. And that can be really difficult with the short-term nature of our sort of postdoctoral work. And I think it's really important to understand that you need to engage from the start of the process. So rather than, you know, writing your full research grant or writing a paper and then looking for ways that that work can be incorporated into policy, start from the beginning, because it's likely to be more fruitful and it really develops a partnership in that way. Policy change can take years or decades, and it's political. So the focus of the government can change as the government changes, even if there's just a cabinet reshuffle rather than an actual change in government, because your minister isn't the same anymore and they might have different pet projects that they want to focus on. So you need to kind of be agile and be aware of some of those risks. But it also provides opportunities and benefits. And I get a lot of job satisfaction from this type of work. And it sounds corny, but like I feel as though I'm making more of a difference than if I was writing papers and then there wasn't that translation through to policy. It provides links outside of academia, which can be good, especially for early career researchers and PhD students for career opportunities. You get access to diversified funding streams. You can demonstrate the impact of your research. You meet lots of cool, like-minded people and learn different skills. So presenting and talking to non-academic audiences, networking, being able to tell people what your research is, why it's important, and why they might be interested in it in a very sort of short time. So your elevator pitch, basically. So that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Alice. It's really good to have the honesty of your experiences and how you found it. And I think it is kind of like the lottery that, you know, you've got to be in it to win that opportunity to be there with the policymakers. So we'll come back to questions for Alice at the end. But for now, I want to introduce Nick Gellie. So Dr. Nick Gellie has held a few roles and is now wanting to talk to us about collaborating for conservation outcomes and how we can measure that kind of success. So I'll pass straight over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Matt. I'll just share my screen. How are we going? That good?
Good to go.
Excellent. Thanks for the introduction. I'm speaking on Zoom today from Ghana Land. Wanted to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. Today, it's actually good coming after Alice, because this is sort of leads into, I guess, some of the things she spoke about with respect to application. And currently I'm working on a project with the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment and CSIR as partners. I work for TERN, and we're looking at aspects of incorporating a monitoring, evaluation and research network into the current RLP projects. So I thought I'd introduce this with a bit of a quote, because I don't mind a quote. And this fellow is very quotable through time. Also sort of synthesise the idea of, I guess, blueprints for action with this. And coincidentally, it was written in 1998, which was the year before the EPBC Act came out. So, which was ultimately the law underpinning most of the decisions made from a federal level across the Australian continent. I'll speak to that also. So just a bit of an overview. I'm going to give you some background of how the Australian government invests in conservation and restoration, how it's measured, the aspects of the pilot network which I'm currently working on, and where we're actually at with that project. So just for some background, I guess everybody's aware that the challenges from global change are quite urgent. They're in the news all the time. In fact, this year begins the UN decade of ecological restoration, and aspects of huge aspirational goals right across the planet, including the Bond Challenge and Africa 100. And from the perspective of the Australian government, the Commonwealth government, they've committed significant funds towards conservation and ecological restoration. The most recent of those is throughout their program of the Regional Land Partnership. So just some background on that. It's the flagship for NRM programs in Australia. It's the largest component of the government's National Land Care program. It started in 2018. There's a capital investment of approximately $450 million over that 5 years. You've got in excess of 200 projects across 54 management units. That's NRM management units. And these projects are aligned with priorities for the government. There's four primary environmental areas that the RLP project addresses, and again these tie back into the Act and exactly how Alice introduced it as the obligations the government has. So the four environmental areas are Ramsar wetlands, which we have 4 of in South Australia, including Piccaninny Ponds, and what else we got? Ecology lakes, and there's threatened species, 200 odd listed from a national perspective in South Australia. We have one World Heritage Site, which is down at Narracog Caves, and national threatened ecological communities. So I think there's 11 or 12 of those in South Australia. Those four components take up about 3/4 of those 200 projects I just spoke to. The other quarter are also involved in agriculture, and in particular sort of sustainable agricultural practices. So that consists where most of that funding for RLP is going. So the RLP, besides, I guess in the last quarter of a century, the federal government has spent significant funds into conservation and the activities going into that from a land management perspective. I've got a figure there, and that goes across the Caring for Country, biodiversity funds and previous policies. And one of the things that's sort of come up from that is that sometimes been difficult to assess the impact of these investments, because often it's reporting on these activities such as fencing, revegetation, etc., rather than the outcomes, and which might be species recovery. And the RLP program is definitely directed towards outcome reporting, where they can work towards those 4 environmental aspects in particular. There's also there has been a lack of consistent baseline data for areas that have been worked on, and indeed long-term data from which to make projections and prescriptions. Also, data storage has often been quite disparate in different areas and not necessarily standardised. All of these sort of come together that have made it sometimes difficult to have generalised ideas of effectiveness across the national scale. To that end, the government engaged with Griffith University to put together a report which came out last year and put forward a long-term monitoring framework towards the RLP program, and addressed those particular issues I just had on the last slide with respect to how that can be implemented within the RLP. The last of those points, it also prescribes a structure for the data generation, management and accessibility, and how to extrapolate that data for future NRM investment. And that will be the next round of the RLP, however that may manifest, and working towards that future. And that's where the government's engaged with the people that I work for, TURN, and also for the CSIRO, because they're implementing some of those ideas from the LTMF and using some expertise that we have at TURN, which in particular the training and the monitoring expertise, and also the scientific research capacity of the CSIRO to implement this MIR network within the RLP program. So the MIR network conceptually has been utilised in some other fields as well, but is particularly question focused, using hypothesis about particular aspects of those interventions that are used in RLP and NRM, and addressing them with experimental controls and a robust design. They're embedded within the system, so you have those 200 odd projects across the country looking at specific aspects of what the interventions are, having an assessment and leading into sort of adaptive management capacity for the programs. They're also networked. There's great benefits in networking these types of interventions because they're so context dependent. Some good examples are nutrient network, tree diversity network, where you have a standardised methodology that is incorporated right across the globe, and then you can have a look at some of those context dependencies and weed out some management actions and learning from those. But also, we also need to be within the vision of the department in sharing this knowledge across and being able to adapt to next rounds of investment, and also accessible from a data perspective. So just to introduce the network, which started up last year, we're currently engaging with RLP service providers to stratify and implement the program. We've also gone through the scoping process of deciding what the key questions are that we'll be asking and how they'll be applied on ground. And it's also important to know that this is embedded nationally across all of these programs. So another issue for people trying to do assessments is going across jurisdictional boundaries, which can sometimes be very difficult to navigate. So just in the scoping perspective, we engage with many experts and also the core project crew to have a look at what the key aims for such a network would be. And on the back of the devastating 2019-20 fires that happened across the East Coast and down through the sort of Mediterranean biome of Australia, we chose fire as a core component, which is also funded from the department in different streams. But fire was pivotal, and there was a lot of RLP projects that were affected by that. So we thought that it was a good time to engage and have a look at aspects of fire. And the second component is looking at weeds post-fire. So we chose those aims as the way that we'd set this network up. We then engaged with RLP service providers to see capacity, recommendations, what they thought was possible and important, and the feasibility of measuring during a network, and got a lot of very important pivotal information from those initial workshops. We also had a look at current data, which is lodged within what's called a merit system, using what's called a MERI plan, and saw how that could then potentially be aggregated when we collate all of this information from the MIR network. Currently, we've come to a design for the network, as in how it's going to be structured, and looking at those treatments with respect to the burning and the weeds, or the weed treatments, how that will sit across the landscape, also incorporating engagement with the stakeholders and the providers to see how we'll structure that. Currently talking to, I think, approximately about 20 different providers right across the country, which is a great opportunity to network this information, look at recovery and the thresholds that might be there for recovery of landscape post-fire. So on the ground, these will be coming in triplets of the unburnt, burnt, weeded sites, and we'd have replication of that, try to get 4 replicates of those blocks across the landscape at each of the sites. Also, we're in the middle of reviewing the monitoring protocols, many of which have come from the tried and tested methods used by TERN across the country. Reduced emphasis and effort for the way that we'd apply them, because we currently at TERN, it's the amount of efforts needed to do our 1 hectare plots is probably too much to ask of the service providers, and we're currently reviewing how that will be done at each of the sites. Also, as I spoke about earlier, those 4 environmental components and agricultural components, we looked at that and had a look at the areas that have been affected by fire in recent years and also been treated for weeds, and that gave us a way to engage with the people that are actually dealing with these issues. We're also presently developing the methods, which again are part of a larger plan with the federal government to standardise methods across the RLP project, and will incorporate those methods and train the RLP providers and the other people that will be doing the monitoring of this network in time. It also helps to incorporate a package that's holistic, so shows them the power of having a standardised approach and networking the questions across the landscape for those contexts. And that will also be part of the workshopping and seminar series that we'll be conducting over the next couple of years. So the other section is the monitoring when it's implemented, and how we do that with respect to giving some technical assistance. We've just developed an app that will help for the collection of the data that we're looking for the MIR network, and that will be rolled out as we're scoping for as we implement these sites. A lot of additional support is given through the tooling, those workshops. Additional resources are also being developed. It's quite a large project that is asking a lot of the people that are already very busy, but the capacity for it to help to define the effectiveness of those interventions is seen as very important to the federal government. So from that, we get to an evaluation phase where we'll aggregate some of that initial data, and we'll be doing the analysis and the interpretation. And we'll roll that out so that we can see a program scale modelling and have a look at those interventions, look at them critically and see what's working, give an evidence-based approach to the next round of the RLP or however it manifests itself. And then an aspect of communication and the way that we share the knowledge within the system to get better practices is the ultimate goal of putting this all together. So just in summary, the way we're looking at it is from an iterative response to improving the practices, where if we just had the status quo of dealing with environmental change practices, and the restoration success would be getting lower through time because of all number of things with the environment making it more difficult to restore landscape. And we're hoping for that top where as we gain information and we gain the evidence that actually gives you the efficacy of the practices, we incorporate them into the next stage, and the restoration success becomes better. So as I stated earlier, this is part of a broader program that's ultimately driven by the LTMF, and we're looking at the way that will be applied through time. There's a few links here, which I think Matt will probably put into the comments that gives you a bit more information. The workshops that we've done so far have all been recorded and you can gain access through this. And there's also a project website that gives you a bit more information. Also, if you'd like to be involved. A bit of plug for the people that I work for. We're just up here at Wait. If you ever want to come up, I can take you through what we have and what we do. We've got a collection here that's accessible for all researchers, free to use, part of the NCRIS facility nationally, and great mob of people that are doing really interesting work. So just wanted to say thank you and for inviting me to come and talk, and also for listening today.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. It's great to hear from you and great to have that kind of perspective of, a range of topics and from a range of different approaches, not just from the university. So I won't take any more time. I'll jump straight over to Rachel. So Professor Rachel Ankeny is going to be talking about how we can engage the public with this kind of policy making. So hand straight over to you, Rachel.
Thanks very much. And again, I want to acknowledge that I'm sitting on Kaurna land, which has never been ceded, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. So my talk's going to be a bit different, but I think there's points that it picks up on from the previous two speakers. We often talk about policy needing to engage the public and involve the public, but how can you do this in a meaningful way? And just like the so-called hard sciences have methods, there are a range of different kinds of methods in the social sciences that in fact do this, that actually measure when and how the public is engaged, and they use various sort of ways of doing that. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. So, sorry, now I can't seem to put my slides forward. That's weird. Basically, public views are notoriously complicated, and I've just put up a whole series of examples here. But the idea is that public views on science and science policy don't necessarily come directly off the facts. So for example, people's views about pollution have to do with the kinds of things they do in their everyday life and how they see control of pollution as relating to daily practices. Risk is notoriously complex and really particularly more complex in times when threats are perceived to be great. So that would be at the current moment. And the public evaluates risks in different ways. And finally, and these obviously all relate to COVID in some way as well, knowing more about the science often results in more polarization rather than more agreement or clarity or what we might see as rational. So against that backdrop, how can we, in some systematic way, allow the public to actually contribute to policy making? Basically, I would contend that public engagement, despite the fact that people are inconsistent and sometimes not as knowledgeable as we might wish, public engagement is still absolutely essential because we're interested not just in the facts and the science, but the values that relate to the kinds of applications or implementation that's at stake in the policy domain. Second, scientific research findings don't lead directly to policy. There's always going to be the need to contextualize it and to make judgment calls in a broader context about the risks, the benefits, the economics, the social implications, and so on. So the methods that we typically use to sort of look at involving the public is everything from surveys or polls, which I think are really too limited, as I'll say in a moment, consultations of various sorts, public hearings and town meetings, and at the other end of the spectrum, things like citizen juries, consensus conferences, and deliberative methodologies. The biggest complaint about these kinds of methods in general is that they often come after the fact. They're often utilized when basically the decisions have already been made, and so they're just a rubber stamp, or they're used in the context of research where it isn't clear, even if an outcome is devised in engagement with the public, how it is actually going to play into policy. And so this is a little bit of a diagram that I borrowed, but you can see the top model is the deficit model, which is variously focused on this notion that the problem with the public is that they don't have enough knowledge. They gloss it here to know science is to love it. So basically people should simply embrace the science. But the bottom line with the deficit model is it tends to be one-way information transfer. And we do a lot of this in Australia. We do it pretty well. There can be useful. And this includes awareness projects and survey projects, a lot of what Biotech Australia did historically, much of what goes on in National Science Week, Science at the Pub, and many, many forms of science communication tends to be just imparting information. The so-called dialogical model is a little bit more complex, which does mean there needs to be a two-way communication at very least, and so on. And you can see here, again, there's examples of this in the UK and Ireland. I would say, for instance, a domain I know fairly well, we have had some consideration, for example, about cloning and embryo research where the public was involved, but it tended to be people presented their ideas, scientists presented their ideas. There wasn't a lot of interchange, if you will. But the model that I really prefer and that I'm going to try and convince you of is a more participatory model where people work together, they co-construct, and the public becomes involved not just in deciding what happens with the research, but even planning the research in the first place. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they become experts, but they are experts on what they know. They're experts on their communities. They themselves will have expertise based on their whatever jobs they have, whatever they do in their daily lives. It's that kind of so-called lay expertise that's absolutely essential to involve the public as a type of collaborator. And here we have had some examples of this often in the research domain. For example, talking to people about pandemics and flu was a big project that was based in Adelaide for a while. More generally, we see so-called co-constructed research in the social sciences. And as I said, this is where the public becomes integrally involved in the processes. So one thing I want to convince you of is to abandon the deficit model. The deficit model, at this point is very old school, but it does come back again because it's easier to do. It's easier to engage the public if what you think is you just need to educate the public. And that what the problem is, either in terms of trust in science or involvement in policy, is just that they don't have enough or very good information. And I would say this model is really on the rise again, particularly because of fear and so on relating to COVID. Instead, what we promote typically is that you need to listen, you need to engage in dialogue, don't just talk in a unidirectional manner. But more importantly, constantly return to the factors that shape individuals' decisions. And these include their values, their identities, and their ideologies. And so as I hinted already, my preferred model for involving the public is a so-called deliberative and democratic model. Particularly for policy, this is good because it does involve needing to make a decision at the end. That's the kind of basis of, say, the democratic part of the deliberative democratic model. But it also requires deliberation, and true deliberation means being open, being flexible, allowing people to bring their sources of knowledge to the table, and these can include, as I said, lay knowledge. It would also include indigenous sources of knowledge and so on. and it doesn't require that people have any particular expertise. The other key point here is the idea is to try and get diverse people to focus on coming up with an outcome that can be shared in society. So that's, the basis of needing to make policy is coming to these shared decisions. And the main outcome in these kinds of deliberative events is trying to come up with a policy proposal, even if people still might disagree. So they may disagree on some underlying attributes or some underlying factors and so on, but they can come to an agreement about what is the best policy in this particular context at this particular moment. So my lessons, sort of takeaways from you, it's important in this kind of domain to engage on even basic issues. People have really different ideas of how science works. I think it's important that science be a process rather than a product, that it be a way of knowing among many. It has certain attributes, systematization of knowledge, but that this also coincide with using other sources of knowledge that aren't necessarily coming out of formal science. And this then is going to force us to use more plastic notions of what counts as expertise. Finally, in these kinds of domains, you can't just assume that the policy reads right out of the scientific evidence. There needs to be continued engagement in sort of proving that science has come up with answers that are useful, not necessarily correct. They're going to change over time. They need to be open to scrutiny and review, but that they're useful in order to better our society, improve our environment, and so on. And so this little diagram that I've borrowed from a paper is you need to think about a range of factors when you think about how to engage with the public, particularly towards a policy outcome, which includes kind of obvious things, but what do you do at the front end about providing information? How do you think about who is affected by a policy or a policy decision? Then how do you actually engage around that kind of policy decision? And then how do you know if you've gotten a good one? And the key here is legitimate policy. Is it the sort of thing that will be acceptable to your diverse parties, or we call them publics, that have come together to think about the policy outcome? So takeaways. Engagement with the public should be constantly evaluated. It's not just something you do once you've got a product or an outcome. You should be doing it on an ongoing basis, and you should constantly evaluate. I think the sign isn't necessarily that people like the outcome, but that they're finding it interesting and that they're continuing to engage. Making policy doesn't require that you capitulate to public views, but it does require adequate consideration of them. And to do so, you need to look at underlying values. The public's never going to be expert on your science. That's not the point. That's why scientists are expert on the science. They are expert on being a citizen in this society, and that's what policy is about. And so we need to find ways to find the shared values and find a best way forward. So all of this is going to require making available both the best available science, but also social science, to do the engagement well, to do the deliberation well, and then to evaluate that the proposed policy outcomes are the right ones. And so I just want to put a plug in at the end. Among the many things that I do at Adelaide, I actually lead what's called the Public Engagement in Science Technology Adelaide Research Cluster. And we welcome people to come along. We do a seminar series by Zoom these days. But also we've got a range of projects on citizen science, on industry engagement, and other things that bring together both scientists and those working in technology with people working in HASS subjects. And so it's a great way to meet people, as was said earlier, sort of outside your usual circles, but particularly if you're interested in doing more or doing better in this domain of public engagement and involving the public in decision making. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rachel. So I want now to bring Nick, Alice, and Rachel back to the floor or the Zoom. And if you have any questions, people joining us live now, if you have any questions for any of the three participants or a question you want to ask in general, please type them into the chat line or the Q&A now. We've got a good 10-15 minutes to have a bit of a discussion now. So I'll start with one that's in the Q&A. So this one's from Elizabetta, who's asking, how can we conciliate between the objectives of studies of our science or our social science and perhaps the more opinionated public So she asked, what happens, for example, if the results of a research contrast with some of the beliefs of a specific community? How do you balance those differences? So I think that was directed at you, Rachel, but if anyone wants to jump in.
So, I mean, I think the key there is that you may never get everyone on board. People are going to disagree. They're particularly going to disagree with the way you interpret the results. In other words, what does it mean? So I think we see that in the current COVID case, the biggest issue is about risk and whether people think they're at risk or not. And having had these arguments with a lot of people in my family, the attitude is we're not at a lot of risk sitting here in Adelaide because we're in pretty good shape here in Adelaide. So why should I take any risk on, particularly with something that hasn't been that proven? I wouldn't disagree with them. I mean, it is the case the current vaccines aren't as proven as our flu vaccines or other things. There's not a difference of fact there. There's a difference in interpretation. And I think there, we need to keep trying to work with people, particularly where the outcomes are significant, right? To work with people to try to get our head around, what are they really anxious about? What are they really nervous about here? It isn't the case that more information is necessarily going to change their mind. But the hard thing about being a policymaker at the end, you make a decision and society then lives with it, right? And so often in some domains, we just let 1,000 flowers bloom. At the moment, it's a personal decision whether you get a vaccine, right? But the policymakers who are thinking about what levers do we use are going to have to make that hard decision if we simply override those kinds of concerns and say it's obligatory. That will never happen, by the way. Do we make people's lives difficult until they do it? Maybe. That's a really indirect way of doing it. But policy is always about the greater good for society, which does involve, looking at this balance of things, but still also representing minority views where there are going to be even some small groups very adversely affected, right? And that's why it's so tricky.
Yeah. Nick or Alice, is there anything you guys can add to that point? Anything from your experience of, even if it's, challenges you've had when you've tried to do something on the ground?
No, I think like Rachel, sorry, Nick. Yeah, Rachel's definitely the expert in this area, but it's a very similar story with climate change, and it's the same challenges, that bombarding people with facts and information isn't the way to change people's minds. I'm not an expert on what is the way to change people's minds, but I think that history has proven that that's definitely not what's going to make people change their minds.
Yeah,
I think some of the things we see, and Nick, you may have some of these similar programs in your area. In the area here, I'm sitting on the Port River looking out, about trying to promote peaceful coexistence between, people who care about the birds and dolphins, people who care about the mangroves and the boaters and the fishermen, and trying to say, look, these can all peacefully coexist, but there's got to be some rules. And so let's try and make this work. That kind of proceeding through almost a gentle, let us teach more about from each point of view what's going on, is working better than the old ways of doing it used to work. I don't know. And Nick, you do some stuff like that within some of the programs, I think, for NRM.
That's correct. And it's also a very interesting space, because often many of these projects are on the sort of peri-urban fringe. They may encompass different types of land units that range from parks through to pastoral, etc. And from previous, we've only just begun this project, but from previous experience working across different types of restoration strategies, those early relationships that are built are so pivotal. I remember I was told by somebody that I very much care about their advice, that you can put people off very quickly, especially from a scientific perspective, that might be outcome-based, sort of, look, this is what I want to do, totally impractical for somebody that's actually on the ground. I need to put this big cage that goes bang and will whatever do, is just, these people are very busy. So communicating where it sits within policy, the greater perspective, how it interacts with everybody else before the imposition, and the relationship that's built through time, is also helping towards making those policy decisions and those adaptive management decisions down the line a lot easier. The languages, I think, Alice, you talked about language as well, and many of the things that I'll be doing over the next few years will go into, policy briefings and documents for ministers, and being succinct without jargon, and getting rid of all of that narrative that unfortunately our profession is often bogged down in, and down to those important facets that can help decision makers make decisions. But we need to work very, very diligently in the science fraternity to try to do that as well. I think that's part of the problems that's giving people fatigue about climate and other things, is that often they just get weighed down by the weight of the language, and you need to get back to the important components that can help people make decisions.
I want to maybe add to this discussion and say, on a personal level for the three of you, how do you divide your time between building these new collaborations and these new relationships between you as a busy researcher and a busy person having a life, but also trying to, start new relationships with policymakers and start new collaborations with other organizations? How much of your time do you spend on just building and maintaining those collaborations, or how do you divide your time? Do you say, I do it in the afternoons on Wednesday? Do you have any thoughts on that?
You can't just dedicate a certain, because you have to be flexible according to that seems kind of obvious to say. I tend to be opportunistic. When things come along, I nurture them. But I would say I probably spend a good half day a week, at least in total, and for me, it's also following up on relationships with scientists I've met, others who are doing interesting things to think about these kind of interdisciplinary projects that we do. For me, that's as important a part of doing the research as, quote unquote, doing the research, right? Because without that background, the relationships that Nick talked about, it's just not going to happen, first of all. And second of all, even if you manage to make it happen in some form, it's not going to function very well. And so I would say that's almost more time consuming than the actually doing the research, at least for me. But I work in a very interdisciplinary kind of space. I'm not sitting at a microscope all day or anything typically.
Alice, any thoughts on that?
I'd iterate that as well. I guess the availability is important, especially if you're, for instance, a farmer or a service provider that's spraying weeds early in the morning or whatever it might be. Sometimes that's the opportunity. A cup of coffee and a cake at the back of the tyre of his Massey Ferguson is often where you can get some work done. And it's interesting. I actually come from a primary industries background from fishing, and the languages and the narratives used within the science and the productivity, these different sort of realms, and within government as well. Trying to navigate that. I in some respects, putting this together was difficult. These acronyms that are just like, whoa! There are so many people that I'd work with that, especially at the applied side and being out in the field, they just turn off straight away. And unfortunately, I had to put them there because they're part of this narrative. But I also hope that we can find ways to go through that during this whole project to get over that hump of just that word soup that seems to be tied into policy as well.
Yeah, I don't really know how to quantify that. It's a real struggle when you're doing research and you're on soft money and you are trying to juggle between writing a research grant, or writing a paper, or spending time developing relationships when your contract is ending in a couple of months and you don't know if you're going to be here to actually get anything fruitful from those relationships. So it is really difficult, and it comes down to that sort of decision that you have to make about what's, I don't know, I guess I kind of just think what's more important to me, like in terms of my job satisfaction, and that's a risk, because I don't have, the strongest publication record for my for my career stage, and that probably is because I've done more applied types of work and written lots of reports and had this interaction with government and industry, but you know, that's at the cost of something else. But it does provide other opportunities, you know, like it provides that network, and it potentially provides career opportunities outside of academia if that's what you want to pursue as well. So it does sort of give I think it develops relationships that give you options. So it's worth investing in, not just purely because your research might benefit, but also there might be other personal benefits from developing those relationships and having those connections outside of academia.
Yeah. I've got one more question here from the audience. So it's from Wayne, who asks, where does the controlling influence of bureaucrats fit in with the development and adoption of policy?
I'm not sure what that means. I mean, so many people who, I mean, if you mean by bureaucrats, there's lots of people involved in policy who you might see as bureaucrats. I think, I mean, I'm reading into it. What it might mean is, you know, there's too many people who just sort of take control over things without thinking creatively or inventively about policy. I usually get the question about politicians who know what answer they want, you know. And I think the key thing there is really empowering scientists, but also empowering publics and others to contribute, to have an opinion, to engage in policy, and not just assume that it's already, you know, a predestined decision or that nothing they say will make a difference. And there's lots of places where, you know, public opinion did actually make a difference. And so I'm very optimistic, at least here, you know, in Australia. I think we do have the ability to engage in policy. It's not always going to go the way you want it to go. It's been a long road, and climate change is a really good example. But that, you know, it's extremely important for scientists to think about how what they're doing could contribute, and to find ways to engage, like Alice has been doing, for instance.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand, again, like, for example, in government, what the hierarchy is. Sometimes that can be really opaque from an outsider's point of view. And so who are those people who are kind of the gatekeepers, and trying to work out how you can develop meaningful relationships with those people so you potentially have more influence over their decision making, or at least have some audience with them, so that you have an opportunity to talk to them and try and influence their control over policy making. And also, you know, going back to that whole thing about understanding what are the obligations, what are the things that they need to be ticking off, what are the things that their managers are looking at in terms of their achievements. And if you can try and align your research with making their life easier, making their decision-making processes easier, then that helps too. But yeah, it is difficult and sometimes frustrating.
Yeah. All right, I might wrap it up there since we're getting to the end of the time. So I want to say thank you again to our three speakers. So thank you, Alice, Nick, and Rachel. And thank you all for joining us here live today. I'll just wrap up with one more thing. So next month, and for the next 3 months, the focus of this seminar series will be looking at our origins as a species and celebrating the 150 years since Darwin's The Descent of Man. So you can join at the link down the bottom there in the QR code and check us out. So for the next 3 months, that'll be us. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next month.